I hope you've been enjoying the day so far, and very much looking forward to having a chance to talking to you all now about Delphi. So the talk today is going to link into the classic and ancient history curriculum in a couple of different ways. We're going to be thinking first and foremost for the first 20 minutes or so about the oracle, the Pythian priestess, and her role within the bigger concept of Greek religion. We're then going to be hitting some of the highlights of art and architecture that can be found at Delphi that are key works that you'll be considering when you're looking at classics in particular. And then we're going to also be thinking about Persian wars and how that is commemorated through Delphi. And then I'm thinking about ideas of Greek unity and how that is communicated, or rather the disunity that is communicated through Delphi. So the first and most important thing is to show you something like this, which I think too rarely gets shown when you're talking about Delphi. Many of you might not even know where to say, where is the sanctuary of Apollo in this image? Bottom left, bottom right, top left. Any ideas? Shout out. Top left. Yes, you're right. Here we are. You can just about figure out the temple of Apollo here and the sanctuary. But this is what we need to be thinking about when we think about Delphi. Not just the sanctuary of Apollo sitting in the middle of their hillside, but a community of people living around the sanctuary, working with the sanctuary. And not just obviously the sanctuary of Apollo, but another sanctuary of Athena down here. And then over time, you get the gymnasium, you get the stadium, you get a big theatre, you get a whole community build. This is where our Pythian priestess comes from. We know relatively little about her, and I'll come on to that why, but fundamentally we know she had to be a Delphian. This community of people probably was never more than 1,000 in terms of male citizens, right? So add a few more to that when we talk about women and slaves. But still, not a large community from which the Pythian priestess came for over 1,000 years that the Delphic oracle was active. We have to dial forward to almost the sort of first century BC, first century AD, before we start to get some really detailed information about who and how this person was chosen. The ancient writer Plutarch tells us that the priestess was chosen from the soundest and most respected families to be found in Delphi. But he's not referring there to elite aristocratic status necessarily. He's talking about people who have always led an irreproachable life. Or even if, as he puts it, they've been brought up in the homes of poor peasants. In fact, that could actually be seen as a real advantage, because not having the education, not having the skill, the techne, to be able to twist the words of the god might mean that she was an even better and more faithful mouthpiece for the god. Once chosen, she served for life. She was given a house to live in, at least from the 4th century BC onwards, that was somewhere here. We haven't yet found it archaeologically, but we'd love to. So she moved apart, as it were, from the rest of her community. And Plutarch also tells us that in his day, there's only one Pythia. But that in the past, when the oracle had been super busy and super popular, they had had 2 going simultaneously with a 3rd in reserve. Changes our impression somewhat of this position in the so-called heyday of Delphi, the archaic and classical periods, that actually there might not have been just one person, but a couple that were there to serve the ever-growing numbers of people who came from all over the Greek world to consult. Was she young or old? Well, we're told again by the sources that it began, when the Delphi began from the 8th century onwards, they picked a young girl, 17, 18 max. But then they had a slight problem in that this girl fell in love with one of her consultants and gave a response that was seen as a corrupt, bribed response. And as a result, after that, they decided that young people were untrustworthy, and so they always, after that, picked a 50-year-old woman, but dressed her in the clothes of a 17-year-old girl. Start to think about the slightly bizarre experience it must have been consulting the oracle when you finally come face to face with this Pythian priestess, and start to have a think about what it was like for the Pythian priestess herself. A 50-year-old woman, she could have been married, she could have kids, but once she became the Pythian priestess, she moved off into her house, and she was sworn to a life evermore of chastity, giving up a life that you had experienced and been a full part of to take up a very different role. Fundamentally, the Pythia was not always available for consultation. You guys know this, right? 1 day a month for 9 months of the year. That was it. If you missed your chance to get a meeting with her, to get a consultation with her, you either had to wait to the next month or potentially you had to wait through to the next year. And what happened on those days? Well, the Pythia would start her day with purification. She would head to the Castalian spring. It's in this corner here. You can still visit it today, or at least see the water cascading down from the mountain to purify herself. She would burn offerings to the gods in front of the Temple of Apollo, and we can zoom in a little bit more now. This is the image we're more used to seeing of Delphi, the Temple of Apollo, there resplendent in the center with this pathway that runs through the sanctuary down to the entrance down here. She would move up to the temple and burn offerings in front of the temple. Crucially, even on these 9 days a year, there had to be a test at this point to make sure that the god Apollo was actually still willing, even on this one day, to be consulted. How was this test done? They would take a goat, they would sprinkle some cold water on it. If the goat shuddered, the god was willing. If the goat did not shudder, the god was not willing. And this leads to stories, particularly in later years when they're desperate for the day to go ahead, of them pouring entire buckets of icy water over this poor goat to make sure it shuddered. Consultants have been arriving in their droves. You don't want to miss the day. You probably turn up a day or two before, coming on journeys from all over the Greek world, all over the Mediterranean world, and even further afield. You're camping out around the sanctuary, waiting for your chance. There's a long line of you. You have to line up. You have to do it in order. Who goes first? Who do you think gets to go first in the queue to consult the Delphic oracle? Any ideas? Go for it.
Like Athenian, I suppose, officials and like government people?
Athenians, yeah. When we study Greek history, it's always about Athens, isn't it? Athens. Athenians. Who else might actually be even more important here than Athenians?
People who paid the most.
People who paid the most. We'll come to how much they paid. Nice idea, very capitalist, very kind of 21st century. And there were those who did that. King Croesus of Lydia throws silver and gold at the sanctuary and even gives an individual amount of money to every single Delphian citizen. Right? But he still has to wait his turn. Who goes first consulting the Delphic oracle?
First person in the line.
First person in the line, first person to get there. Another nice idea. Yeah, if you turn up a month before, you get to go first. No, it's not them. Yeah. People from Delphi, absolutely. It's their oracle. Delphians always get to go first. Then you get the Greeks, including the Athenians. Then you get members of what's known as the Amphictyoni, the ruling council, if you like, of Delphi. So if you're from a place that's got a representative on this ruling council, you get to go next after the Delphians. Then you get the rest of the Greeks, then you get the non-Greeks. So in this lineup that you can imagine snaking its way from the entrance to the temple through the sanctuary, you've got a visible sort of representation of who's most important here and who's least important here. How much do they pay? You ask that question. Well, it's one of those things that we only have a little bit of evidence for. But actually the evidence is that different people from different places paid different amounts. So there was a system that decided, Athens, you guys are super rich. You're going to pay lots. You're from this tiny island in the Aegean we've never heard of? Well, you don't have to pay so much. And are you here on a state matter of business, or are you here on a personal matter? Because for you from Athens, there's a different price you pay if you're here on a personal matter to being on a state matter, just as there is from whatever island or place you come from. So every place who comes to consult the Delphic oracle probably had at least 2 different prices that they were offered that they had to pay to consult. And you didn't actually hand over cash to the Pythia. She's not got like a big cash registry next to her going ka-ching, thank you very much. You have to translate that money into the buying of religious offerings, which you burn on the altar before you go into the consultation. The idea of this is a financial transaction, and it's what Delphi and the Delphian citizens thrive off and survive off. But actually, it's coached in the terms of Greek religious ritual and behavior and honor to the gods. You had to be a man consulting, ironically, given it's a woman, a Pythian priestess you're going to see. And if you weren't from Delphi, you also had to have a local Delphic sponsor. Another way for the local Delphians to make a bit of money on the side, perhaps. You were told to move forward towards the inner, here's the front of the temple. This is the latest architectural plan of the Temple of Apollo. Here's your entrance. You were told to move forward, getting towards the sacred inner heart part here, thinking pure thoughts. You had to go in thinking pure thoughts. And then what happened? You got inside. Pythia's somewhere around here. In the latest plan of the architecture of the temple, they think they've found a sort of little niche, architecturally built niche in the back left-hand side, perhaps where she was sitting. But what was it actually like when you got to pose your question, that thing you'd come for all this way? We don't know. There's not a single source surviving from the entire ancient world that tells us clearly exactly how the consultation took place. Now, that absence could be explained in one of two ways, and has been. The first is that it was so bleeding obvious that everyone knew how the consultation took place, and as a result, no one needed to write it down and tell you. Herodotus, for instance, when he's talking about oracles at other sanctuaries, says, oh, it happens here just like it happens at Delphi, as if everyone knows how it happens at Delphi. The alternative explanation is that it's the best and most closely guarded secret in ancient Greek culture. Take your pick. Some of you say, hang on a second, I know exactly how it took place. He was breathing in gases, right? That's the famous story. This is some of the artistic representations that have been offered of the Pythian priestess, sitting on this three-legged tripod, looks pretty uncomfortable, breathing in gases that are coming from a hole in the ground beneath her, and being, as a result, inspired by the god. But when you look back at the ancient sources, this story about gases does not emerge again until the 1st century BC. When Diodorus Siculus tells us about a particular place in the Delphi Mountains, before Delphi ever existed, but in the Parnassian Mountains, where Delphi would later be located, but before Delphi even existed, whereby shepherds, when they took their flocks up there, would see sheep go over a particular hole in the ground and suddenly go a bit weird. And if a shepherd went over that hole in the ground, he too went a bit weird. So in Diodorus Siculus's terms, what they did was put a three-legged stool over the hole in the ground and sat a woman on the stool so that no one else would go weird. And this story of the gases, of being inspired, has taken hold. When the French excavators, it was the French archaeologists who originally dug Delphi, when they dug the temple, all they wanted to find was this hole in the ground. And when they didn't find a hole in the ground in the center of the temple where these gases could have come up from, they were absolutely livid with anger. You can read it in the sources. They feel like they've been betrayed by the ancients who lied to them. Then in the 1990s, a team of John Hale and Jelly de Boer came along, a geologist and ancient historian, determined to prove that the gas idea could be true. And they did. It turns out that there are two seismic fault lines that cross deep under the ground, and they cross almost exactly under where the Temple of Apollo has been located. They proved that as a result of the friction of these seismic fault lines as they moved, gases were released, which because of the particular kind of limestone in this area, bituminous limestone, could come up through the small gaps in the limestone to the surface. And they proved that the gas ethylene was present at the surface even today in the water at Delphi. So be careful when you drink the water at Delphi. Because ethylene, this is it being used in the 1920s in the US for psychological experiments, sends you into a hallucinogenic state. Case proven. Right? These gases accumulated. Their theory was that they would accumulate in enough concentration inside the temple to send this Pythian priestess into her hallucination, through which she delivered her responses. The problem with this is that it doesn't really tell us anything. The Pythian priestess was consulted by people for 1,000 years. Would you keep going to a woman who was high on drugs to ask your most important civic and personal questions for 1,000 years? And do you think you'd be getting any kind of sensible answer from her? Hands up. Judith, you're out.
Because it was interpreted by somebody rational, maybe, and therefore you would get that.
Okay. So we've got this woman who's out of her head. She's off her head, right? Kind of high on gas, going waffle, 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 complete rubbish. There are people around her, the so-called prophetess of the sources, that turn that waffle and rubbish into sensible responses, or at least non-gobbledygook. Problem again is the sources don't confirm. The only sources we have talking about those prophets, people, come again from quite late on in Delphi's history. The other way people go to try and understand how this process might have worked and how kind of, if she wasn't high on gas, which is, if you remember, was only starts being talked about from the 1st century BC onwards. Before that, people like Aeschylus, Euripides, all the great tragedians actually just talk about her speaking in a very normal voice, just very normal kind of responses. Let's back up a bit. Let's think about Greek religion. Greek religion is a world in which it isn't really possible to not be a believer. It's not like atheism is an option here. Everyone is fundamentally convinced of the fact that the gods can be for you or even against you. And in that kind of world, it becomes absolutely essential to do whatever it takes to find out what the gods have in store. This map just shows you the Peloponnese, right? Part of central, of Attica, Boeotia here, northern Greece all the way up there. Every dot on that map is an oracular sanctuary, a place you could go to consult the gods. Delphi is not a one-off. Delphi may be the most famous, but it is one of a litany of places of constant interaction between human and divine, in which your every thought about your every plan would probably be put up for consultation with the gods in one form or another, in one place or another, at one time or another. Within that world, you are utterly predisposed to believe that that process you are going through comes up with a response which comes from the gods. Many of you will be facing this image, right? That's one thing. The most famous ancient vase painting image that supposedly shows you a representation of the consultation between the Pythia, there she is on her stool, and the consultant. This is a complicated image to actually understand and know as what we do with it as a piece of evidence. It's 5th century BC. It's done by the so-called Codrus painter, who made, we think, images on vases and on drinking ware almost exclusively for export to markets outside of Athens and Greece, especially to the Etruscans over in Italy, where this image was found. That should give you pause for thought. We know other examples of vases and images that are being made to be exported to the Etruscans, for instance, that have Greek written on them, which is complete gobbledygook, rubbish Greek. It makes no sense, because the Etruscans couldn't read Greek. But they knew in Athens that they loved a bit of Greek, right? Or at least what they thought was Greek. This image is made to be consumed by a world outside of the Greeks, almost. Can we thus interpret it as an honest reflection of what goes on at Delphi? Some people have also talked about this column in between. Does this signify just a column holding up the roof, and thus the consultant faced directly the Pythian priestess? Or should we see that as a dividing wall? Was the consultant actually in a separate room and just asked their question and heard the response but didn't see the Pythia? Or might not even have heard the response, just got the response given to them at a later stage? We don't know. And the third complication of this image is this isn't the Pythian priestess. This is Themis being consulted by Aegeus. Themis? Themis? In the 5th century, stories started to be told that actually an oracle had been at Delphi long before Apollo had turned up. Themis is one of the older gods, the older generation of gods, that then handed it down to Apollo. So this image constructed in the 5th century BC is intentionally marketing to a world outside Greece of an earlier moment that supposedly happened centuries ago. It's a very odd piece of evidence for us to claim anything certain as a result about how the consultation took place. Let's go back for a second to that map of the temple. So what happened in this space is still a mystery, in my view. But whether or not the woman was high on, the Pythian priestess was high on gas, whether or not there were prophets interpreting the answers, whether or not you stood in front of the Pythian priestess or you didn't, there are two other elements I want to draw to your attention that helped ensure that you couldn't find the Pythian priestess and the Delphic oracle to be categorically wrong. The first was this. You had to ask your question, not in a simple format, shall I marry this girl? You had to ask it in the form, would it be better for me to marry this girl or not to marry this girl? Oracle tells you to marry the girl. You go away, and it's a complete disaster. She turns out to be a nightmare. You go back to the oracle and you go, you told me to marry the girl. And all the oracle has to say is, yeah, but you have no idea how bad it would have been if you hadn't married her. That demanding a formulation of the question, X or Y, means that categorically you can never prove the oracle has given you bad advice. And equally, the response you got was almost never marry her or don't marry her. It was often, as you'll be familiar with from Herodotus, an extremely complicated, ambiguous response. King Croesus, the guy from Lydia who showered money on the Delphians, asked his question about whether to go to war. The response was, famously, anyone remember it? Anyone know it? What King Croesus got told? Yeah. If you go to war, a great kingdom will fall. And he interpreted that to be his enemy's one, and it turned out to be his own. Croesus actually went back. He got the person he was now captive to, right, to let him go back to Delphi and throw the chains of imprisonment that he'd been put in directly down in front of the temple and accuse them of lying to him. They simply went, no, we didn't lie. You misinterpreted. Or the famous one for the Athenians. Advice before the Persian invasion. Anyone remember this one? Yeah, go for it. Well, how did it go?
It was interpreted two different ways. So it was, some Athenians interpreted it as build a wall around the Acropolis and defend Athens from there, or head to the blessed island Salamis with a fleet of ships.
And that was in response to what was the phrase that the Delphic oracle supposedly gave?
Only a wooden wall would save Athens.
Only a wooden wall will save Athens. We know from the sources the Athenian ambassadors went back home to Athens scratching their heads going, God, what are we going to tell them? Right? The enemy is approaching, we've got to make a decision, and the Delphic oracle has told us to trust in our wooden walls. Right? Only wooden walls will save us. What they end up doing, very democratic Athens, is having a big debate about how to understand that response. And they make their own decision about how to respond. So what people have moved away from is thinking about the Delphic oracle as some kind of mystic Meg fortune teller character, towards being what we might call a sense-making mechanism. It's not giving you the answer. It's helping you on the process towards making your own decision. Heraclitus, one of the famous commentators about the oracle in antiquity, famously said, "The oracle does not reveal, but merely indicates. Leaves you to make the decision." And when I've spoken to about the oracle in the past to people from business, they go, "Oh yeah, it's like a management consultant. They charge you an awful lot of money. They tell you stuff you pretty much already know and leave you to go away and make a decision." The Pythian priestess was not your only option at Delphi. Here's a picture of Delphi. Here's the modern town. Here's the ancient site. You could also, if you missed one of those 9 days a year, go up above Delphi to the mountains above, to the Carycian cave, where you could consult a form of dice oracle. We also know that there was a lot oracle, where a random throwing of assorted things that was then interpreted, that happened in the sanctuary. So there were lots of different options depending on when you turned up, how long you could afford to wait around. Right? All as part of that littered canvas of ways of consulting with the gods. People talk about the constant hum of divine human communication. And what you get as a result is the oracle at Delphi being involved in all of these sorts of major issues. And there is not a single recorded case in ancient Greek sources of the oracle of Delphi, their response being categorically found to be wrong. Sometimes the oracle is accused of bribery, but always fault is found with the individuals in the process. The poor Pythian priestess. She got seduced. She fell in love. Replace her, put a new one in. The cog may be defective, but the machinery, the system, is not at fault. The closest you get to an example where people are being a bit suspicious, what we might take a very modern kind of almost atheist, how could this possibly be the word of the god, is in the 4th century BCE when the Athenians want to consult the oracle on what to do with some sacred lands. And they have written up a big inscribed document on stone that's survived to us, in which they come up with a very elaborate process to consult the oracle. They can do 2 things with this sacred land. They can farm it or they can not farm it. They put each option, written on a tablet, inside 2 different vases, 2 different materials. They seal the vases. No one knows which one's in which one. And then the question they ask of the oracle is, would it be better for us to pick the bronze or the gold vase? They're trying to isolate themselves and their question from any possible human intervention. How could any human know which response was in which vase, or indeed what the question was? Only the god could possibly know the answer. And as a result, they get a response that they believe is completely trustworthy. So think again about the site for the second half of this, right? The sanctuary as a whole. We've talked about the gymnasium, we've talked about the stadium, we've talked about the 2 major sanctuaries, but there was also religious altars littered around this community to a whole host of gods. Pretty much every Greek god in the pantheon had some kind of point of worship here. But what I'm really interested in is what goes on inside the Apollo sanctuary. All this stuff. Here's the temple. That's all you need to consult the oracle. An altar on the outside. The rest, what is it? These are all dedications from individuals or city-states, like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, to the god Apollo that they have paid for at one point or another in the sanctuary's history. What are they trying to do with this stuff? Delphi is one of the few places that Greeks would come to on a regular basis from all over the Greek world. 1 day a month for 9 months of the year, plus also for the athletic and musical competitions that happened at Delphi. It was a place that people would come to. That's quite rare in the Greek world. Olympia, Delphi, Isthmia, Nemea, those 4 sanctuaries mainly. A bit to Athens, perhaps. But if you wanted the Greek world to know about something you'd achieved, one of the best places to celebrate that achievement was at Delphi, because you knew a lot of Greeks were going to drop by. And it's achievements like, I beat another Greek city in battle, that are being celebrated here. Not mutually kind of exciting achievements. Yay, I was really good, I managed to do this or that without harming somebody else. No, no. The achievements that are being celebrated here are, I am better than you, another Greek city, despite the fact that this is a sanctuary that's supposedly open to all the Greeks. This is a description by one scholar about what it would have been like walking past all this architecture. You're seeing scenes of toes being trodden on, subtle put-downs being uttered, elbows being rammed hard into rivals' ribs as competing stakeholders jockey for position in the continuous cocktail party that is taking place within the cramped confines of the sanctuary. Let's look at a few in detail that occur in the syllabus for you guys to have a think about. Let's start here. This is the Siphnian treasury. Siphnos? A random, completely unimportant island in the Aegean that did nothing of really any importance in the whole history of the Greek world. And yet, they have one of the most expensive and ornate treasury buildings that you can possibly imagine at Delphi, constructed in the last half of the 6th century. It's not only got these caryatid figures instead of columns, but in this reconstruction, you can imagine the amount of stuff all around it, inside it, and then, of course, the beautiful sculpture that survives to this day. The Siphnians even imported Siphnian marble from their island all the way to Delphi to build the walls of their treasury. It's actually made of Siphnos, this small little treasury sitting in this Delphi. And famously, and you'll be studying this in the course, people talk about the art, the frieze that runs all the way around. And particularly, they talk about this side of the frieze, the north frieze, because that is the side that you walked up past as you went up towards the temple, the north side. This was the key side that you would get up close and personal with as you walked past it. You might see a little bit of this side. Actually, you could hardly ever see the other side, and you get to see the front side if you turned around and went in to the building. Here it is, up here. This is the north side. Famously, it's a scene of gigantomachy, the battles of gods and the giants. But it's being sculpted at exactly the same time as the brand new temple of Apollo is being built, and its sculpture is being sculpted in the grounds of the Apollo sanctuary. And so we shouldn't really be surprised that elements like this, a lion biting into a human body, are also seen on the sculpture of the Temple of Apollo. Teams of sculptors working in the same place, copying one another, echoing the great building, the Temple of Apollo, with its sculpture as it goes up within this smaller dedication by the Siphnians. But also, if you compare the sculpture here with the sculpture here, this is from a different side, does anyone want to tell me a difference that they see between the style of the sculpting? Can anyone see a difference between the two? Yeah.
The first side shows kind of more infantry, I guess, fighting, whereas the second one is a bit more kind of cavalry focused.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a lot more action, isn't there, on this north side? They're all kind of, there's a melee going on. And you imagine walking past that as you're slowly taking in the melee as you walk past it. This side, the south side, is the one on the other side of the building that you would only ever see from far away, and you'd never walk past it, you'd statically look at it. And it's a more static scene. You're absolutely right. Is there another difference, though, that anyone wants to bring up? In the style of the sculpting? Yeah.
More stylised.
How do you mean by stylized?
Not so naturalistic.
Yeah. Can you see here the line of the edge of the horse? It just goes straight back into the stone. And you see that everywhere on this sculpture. It's just drilled straight back. Whereas here, on the north side, everything is rounded. Everything is subtle. Everything is more naturalistic. There were different teams of sculptors working on the Siphnian treasury. One team had responsibility for 2 sides, the other team had responsibility for 2 sides. One team sculpted in a much more advanced, naturalistic way, and it's no accident that that team got given responsibility for the sides of the treasury that people would get up close and personal with, that they would see as they walked past on the north side. Whereas the side that people would only see from further away, straight on, is the team that sculpt in a more old-fashioned drill straight back sort of way, more static, less naturalistic kind of way. They're actually changing the people and their skill set who are working on this building, depending on the different sides that you're seeing it. It was also obviously in colour. This is an example of some of it recreated in the colour you can imagine, to pick out the details, including the names of the individual gods and giants that are fighting. And then it had pedimental sculpture, you can see up here, which was a story of Heracles, one of the key, most popular figures in Delphic mythology at the time. Another couple that you have that were in the Delphi Sanctuary that are on your list for curriculum, Cleobis and Beton, 2 sculptures that survive today sitting in the Delphic Museum. And they're called Cleobis and Beton because there's a famous story about Cleobis and Beton who helped their mum out, who was a priestess, and the priestess prayed to the gods to say that she hoped her sons could have the most wonderful life, and so the goddess killed them right there and then because they'd just done the most wonderful thing they could possibly do. They were at the height of their kleos, their fame, and everything after that would be a downward slope. These are called Cleobis and Beton, but we have no idea whether they are actually of Cleobis and Beton. They are signed, but they are made by an Argive sculptor, and as a result, given Cleobis and Beton were from Argos, we assume that they might be representations of, but we have no real idea that they are. The date suggested for their creation is early 6th century BCE. They are more the standing figures of sculpture that we would imagine in this archaic period, the koroi, the men standing with their fists clenched, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back. The very earliest phases, if you like, of classical Greek art. This guy, on the other hand, is much later. The Delphi Charioteer, also another famous dedication within the Sanctuary of Delphi that comes up as an individual piece on your curricula. This guy was discovered, buried in the ground at Delphi. Here's a photo of the day he was discovered. Here he is. There are his feet coming out of the ground again, with the excavators and archaeologists around him on the day he was discovered. Once, he was part of a much bigger group. Here he is. Horses all in bronze, helpers all in bronze, an entire dedication. The figure itself, if you get a chance to see it, is obviously bronze, but was inlaid with silver, with enamel, with precious jewels to bring out the eyes, the eyelashes, the teeth. This was a spectacularly expensive offering of the 5th century BC. Who offered it? Well, it's a complicated story because the inscription that once went along the bottom is only surviving in part. It's been reconstructed in 35 different ways so far. So we're quite certain, it's not quite certain, but it seems to be an offering from the tyrant rulers of Sicily, from the western part of the Greek world, the western Mediterranean, an offering at Delphi showing quite how far Delphi's reach had come, that even these people over in the west were interested and excited enough to celebrate their athletic victories by offering such an expensive dedication. For the last 5-10 minutes or so, let's think about Persian wars and then about issues of Greek unity. How do they get displayed at Delphi? The place to go for the Persian wars at Delphi is right in front of the temple here. This is where all the major monuments to the Persian wars are concentrated. And we can zoom in on a little model and pick out this guy. This is the offering that the Greeks put up after their victory at the Battle of Salamis. And its inscription, again fragmentary, but has been argued to be the first ever use of the word Hellenes in an inscription. Hellenes, the Greeks. Not Athens dedicated this, not Sparta dedicated this, not a small grouping of Greek cities dedicated this, but the Greeks dedicated this. That idea that the Persian invasion forced on the Greek world that had been spending an awful lot of time warring with itself a sense of unity, a sense of themselves as a community of Greeks. The Greeks dedicated this. The following year, after the victory at Plataea, you get this dedication. We can see it in a couple of different forms. This is the model again. This is the model of it here. It was 3 entwined serpents in a 9-meter-high bronze column topped by a golden tripod. This model here is in the modern city of Delphi that has been made by a local artist to give you some kind of sense of what it was like. Anyone know what this is? Any more for anyone? Yeah, go for it. The rest of it nowadays in Istanbul. Why is it in Istanbul? Yeah? Yeah, 4th century AD. It sat at Delphi from the 5th century BCE until the 4th century AD, when the Roman Emperor Constantine, in founding his new capital of Rome, Constantinople, nicked it as a great example of Greek art and put it in the middle of his horse racing track in Istanbul, in Constantinople, where it still stands to this day. And you can visit it looking very forlorn, the twisted body of the serpents, and one of the heads of those serpents, picked out again with gold and precious jewels and other decoration, is in the museum of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, if you get a chance to go and see it. This had no inscription on it saying the Greeks dedicated this. In fact, the story about this monument is that just one general, a Spartan general, wanted to put his name on it. I dedicated this. Pausanias, the Spartan general, dedicated this. But the Greeks made him take that back. They scrubbed it off, and instead they put the name of every Greek city that had taken part in the Battle of Plataea, and in fact the entire Persian wars, on each ring of the serpents as they rose up through the column. Surrounding that, here and at Delphi today, when you go, they've actually just established a model of the serpent column, or at least what's left of it in Istanbul. They've actually put it back up on the spot where it was originally located. But around that, here's your Delphi serpent column, here's your Salamis Apollo, the Greeks dedicated this. You've got all this stuff. All individual dedications. Some of them come later, but some of them are also to do with the Persian Wars, and they're all by individual Greek cities who are claiming and celebrating their own role in the Persian War victories. Some of whom, when you look closely at the detail, did not fight on the Greek side at all. There is a rush here in the aftermath of the surprise Greek victory against the Persians to change the historical story, to rewrite history. How do you do that in the ancient world where there aren't history textbooks? You do it by putting up a monument in a sanctuary and claiming that's what happened. And this is what happens here, including particularly this guy, Alexander I, the king of Macedon, ancestor of Alexander the Great, who was very much on the Persian side in the Persian Wars, claiming later to have always secretly been rooting for the Greeks, and put up an enormous statue of himself, just to make that point clear. The final thing to think about is then Greek unity, or indeed disunity. Even at the moment of the Persian Wars, as I hope we've shown just through those monuments at Delphi, there are sense that the Greeks come together, but also there's the sense that they're still competing with one another to claim that they individually were more important to the victory, or indeed rewriting history to say that they were on the Greek side rather than against the Greeks. The story of the rest of the 5th century at Delphi, I would argue, is more often one of Greek disunity on display than it is of Greek unity. I think this is demonstrated by one example right down here at the entrance to the sanctuary. This area here, you can see here in this model. The first thing to be placed here was these 10 statues by the Athenians back in the 460s BC, in the middle of just before the middle of the 5th century, for a victory they'd had in battle. But by the end of the 5th century, the Athenians, as you well know, had lost the great Peloponnesian War that broke out, that divided the Greek world into an enormous civil war, and they lost to primarily the other side led by the Spartans. The Spartans came along, and how did they represent that victory at Delphi? They built this, right next door to the Athenian monument, with 30 statues in it, rather than just 10, on 3 levels, with more gods in it. And then, just in case the message wasn't clear that the Spartans were now better than the Athenians, they built this stoa on the other side of the walkway. And just in case it still wasn't clear, inside the stoa, they put statues of their commander, they put gold statues of a number of other things. This was not a subtle game. This was absolutely in-your-face one-upmanship. And if we continued the story of Delphi into the 4th century, what you'd see is when the Spartans fell from power and they lost out in the great kind of war, Battle of Greece, 2 things happened here at Delphi. One, the Arcadians turned up and put a monument right in front of their stoa, and this model doesn't do it justice. The Arcadian statues actually just basically obscure any view of the Spartan stoa. And another set of Greek city, the Argives, put something, you can just see the rim of it around the back here, that actually cut into and cut off access to the Spartan stoa. This was actually monument wars in a real form, actually destroying and endangering and monuments that represented your foes on the battlefield. So, what is Delphi, and what does it offer us? So there's another picture we can get. There's our Argives cutting off access to the stoa. Here are our Arcadians completely obscuring the view. This was an image drawn in 1896 when Delphi was first being excavated. A model of the sanctuary full to the brim of stuff. If you think about Delphi just as a place to consult the oracle, you miss out on everything else that this place was to the Greeks. Yes, it was a place to go, a famed place for consultation and connection with the gods. But it was also, crucially, a very, very important place to tell the story of man. And indeed, to write and rewrite that story several times over. Thank you very much indeed.